There is a cost to every choice a man makes, and the men who understand this before they make it are the rarest kind. Most people go through their lives pretending their choices have no consequence, that silence is the same as innocence. But there are men who know better. Men who understand that the moment you see something that needs doing, you have already decided whether you are the kind of person who will do it or the kind who will walk past. This is the story of Silas Beckett, a man who had answered that question once already, in a uniform and under orders, and found the answer so costly that he spent years trying to forget it. That he would be asked to answer it again in the Colorado Territory in the summer of 1878 suggests that some questions do not accept the silence of refusal. Silas Beckett had been a cavalry officer for 17 years. He had ridden through Apache country under colonels who believed that order could be purchased with blood, that the frontier could be tamed if you were willing to be cruel enough. He had followed those orders. When he was 32 years old, on a morning that smelled like sage and dust, he realized he did not know who he was anymore without someone else's voice telling him what to do. He turned in his commission that month. The Army had no use for an officer without appetite for the work, and Silas had no use for the man he had become. He rode west with $1,200 and a horse named Roan. For 5 years, Silas moved through the territories, learning the trade of horse dealing. He studied bloodlines like scripture. He could see a horse's entire future written in muscle and bone. He learned that it was possible to make an honest living if you refused the money that required dishonesty. When he was 43, with gray in his hair, Silas purchased 40 acres south of the foothills in Colorado Territory. The land was high and dry with year-round water from the mountains. He built a cabin with his own hands and began his breeding operation. By 1878, he had 37 horses and a reputation that was solid. Men knew Silas Beckett would tell them the truth about a horse. This was enough. It was a morning in July when Silas found the boy. The land had been hot for 6 weeks straight, the kind of heat that made ranchers lose sleep in August and made the horizon shimmer like water. Silas had ridden out toward the northern pasture to check on a mare that was due to drop a foal. The trail was narrow, threading through junipers and scrub oak, and the land opened up before him into a wide valley that swept up toward the peaks. This was where he saw him, a boy, not more than 14, sitting on his heels beside a spring that ran out of the rocks. The boy's hair was shoulder length and black, and he wore buckskin leggings and a woven cotton shirt that had been torn at the shoulder. On his left wrist was a beaded leather band, dyed in colors that meant something Silas recognized, even if he could not have said precisely what. The boy did not run. He looked up at Silas with the kind of stillness that only comes from a life spent learning to read danger in the smallest movements of the world. There was a wound on his left side beneath the torn shirt, and the wrapping around it was dirty and spotted with blood that had begun to turn brown at the edges. The boy's horse was nowhere to be seen. He was trying to drink from a spring in country that would kill him just as easily as any enemy, if given the chance. Silas did not reach for his rifle. Instead, he got down from Roan slowly, the way you might approach an animal that was wild and injured, and not yet certain whether you meant it harm. The boy watched him, and Silas saw the calculation in the boy's eyes, whether he had the strength to run, whether the wound would open if he did, whether this man on a gray horse was cavalry or something else entirely. "Easy," Silas said. The word meant nothing to the boy, probably, but it was not the word that mattered. It was the tone, low, unhurried, the voice of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to push. "I am not going to hurt you." The boy said nothing. He was studying Silas's face, the weathering in it, the gray at his temples, the way he held himself. "My father is coming," the boy said. His English was broken but clear, each word pronounced separately, as if he had learned them one at a time and had to think before speaking them. "He is coming with many riders." "I know," Silas said. Whether he did or not was less important than acknowledging that the boy had told him something true. "What is your name?" "Takotah," the boy said. In that moment, Silas understood something about himself that he had spent a decade trying not to know. He understood that when he was 32 years old and following orders, he had not been following orders because he believed in them. He had been following orders because it was easier than deciding for himself what kind of man he wanted to be. He had been afraid, and fear is always the most convenient excuse. The cavalry had wanted him to believe that Apache were a threat that required elimination, a problem to be solved with sufficient violence. For 17 years, he had believed it, or had pretended to believe it, well enough that no one could tell the difference. He had been very good at believing what he was told to believe. But now, standing in front of a boy with a wound that smelled like infection and a face that showed no fear, even though he had every reason to be afraid, Silas understood that the choice he had made when he was young had not been the only choice available to him. And he understood something else too. He understood that the boy would die here if no one did anything. Not quickly, but he would die. "Can you ride?" Silas asked. Takotah nodded. "My horse is good," Silas said. "He will not bolt. We ride north, to the mountains. We will find your people." The boy's face did not change, but something in his eyes shifted. It was not hope. Hope was too large an emotion for a boy in this condition. It was something smaller and more durable. It was the acknowledgement of a choice that someone else had made on his behalf, and the decision to trust that choice, even though trust required a kind of courage that most men never have to find in themselves. Silas rode back to his cabin and gathered what he would need: a bedroll, a water skin, jerked beef and hardtack, and pemmican made with berries and fat. He had no medical knowledge beyond what he had learned from animals: how to clean a wound, how to pack it with yarrow if he could find it, how to watch for the signs of infection that would mean the body had already begun the work of dying from the inside out. He found the wound was bad. The edge was already beginning to show the kind of red that spoke of poison moving through tissue. He cleaned it as well as he could with hot water and cloth, and he had some carbolic acid in his medicine chest. Probably worthless, but not harmful. He wrapped it fresh with clean strips of linen. The boy watched all of this with the same stillness. Once, his hand gripped the edge of the table, and Silas saw the boy bite down on his own teeth to keep from crying out. But that was all. When it was done, Takotah sat in a straight-back chair in Silas's cabin and drank water and ate a little bit of the jerky. Silas sat across from him and ate the same things, and they did not speak. There was nothing to say that could be said in words. The decision had been made. They left at dawn. The boy rode behind Silas on roan, one hand holding to Silas's shirt because the wound made it impossible for him to grip a saddle or manage a horse of his own. They did not talk. They rode through country that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Wide open grassland under a sun that seemed to have no mercy, with the mountains rising up ahead of them, like a promise that never quite got closer. The landscape of Colorado Territory in July was the landscape of a world that had been made by something enormous and indifferent, and everything living in it was small and temporary and constantly at risk. By the second day, Takotah had a fever. Silas could feel the boy's body moving against his back with the kind of hot looseness that comes before delirium. He slowed the pace. They camped in a draw where there was water and some shelter from the wind, and Silas spent the evening keeping the fire going and keeping watch. The boy slept, but it was a sleep full of the sounds of pain, small gasping sounds, and his hands sometimes gripping the blankets with the kind of intensity that came from nightmares. On the third day, as they climbed into higher country where the air was thinner and cooler, the fever broke. Takotah sat up a little straighter on Roan's back. His hand, the one holding to Silas's shirt, had some strength in it again. "Your father is a leader," Silas said. "A chief." Takotah did not answer for a long moment. Then, "Yes, he is called Nochi. It means bear in the language before your English. He rides with many people. They are looking. They are always looking. They will find us," Silas said. He did not know if this was true, but it might have been the kind of thing you say to a boy who is carrying fear in his chest, along with an infection in his body. That night, they camped in higher country, where there were still patches of snow in the shadows. Takotah was strong enough to get off Roan without help, though Silas had to help him back on again. They sat by the fire, and Takotah ate more, his body beginning to heal now, or beginning to begin the process of healing. The stars were bright and numerous in the thin air of the mountains. "The cavalry came," Takotah said. His English was better now. The fever had broken something open in him, or the distance was making it easier to speak. "We were in the valley, many families. We were gathering roots and doing the work that women do in the early summer. The cavalry came fast. They had scouts. Our scouts saw them, but not in time." Silas listened. He did not interrupt. He did not explain or defend or apologize. There was fighting. Men fought. Some were killed. We rode. I was on a horse with my brother. The horse was afraid. I fell. My brother had to go with the people. He could not stay with me. It is the law. You do not risk the whole people for one person." "But you stayed," Silas said. "I could not ride. The horse was gone. The wound was bleeding. I walked. I found water. I was walking toward the mountains because the mountains are where we go. The cavalry cannot follow us into the high places. But I was slow, and the wound was bad." Silas understood then. The boy had been walking for 3 or 4 days with an infected wound, following memory and instinct toward the place where his people went in summer. He had been trying to make his way home on his own before anyone could come for him. "You were very brave," Silas said. Takotah shook his head. "I was afraid. Courage is something different. Courage is when you are afraid, and you do it anyway. I was afraid and I could not do anything. I could only walk and be afraid and hope." This was something a child had learned about the world, learned through suffering and survival, and Silas could not think of anything to say that would improve upon it. On the 4th day of traveling, they encountered riders, not Takotah's people, bounty hunters, the kind of men who made their living chasing people who had been given prices on their heads. They had noticed a thin boy in Apache dress 3 days behind Silas and his horse, and they had followed. The logic was simple enough. An Apache boy separated from his tribe might belong to someone who wanted him back. There were settlers who made use of Apache children as slaves, and there were Indian agents who paid for information about the location of bands. There was money in a lost Apache child if you knew where to take him. There were 4 of them. They appeared on the trail ahead, and they did not look particularly dangerous at first. Just men on horses, weathered and hard in the way that men became if they spent long enough in the sun and the dust. But Silas recognized the kind of calculation that moved behind their eyes. "That Apache boy you got there," the nearest one said, "we'll take him off your hands. A lot of people looking for a boy fits his description, worth good money to us." Silas had slowed Roan to a stop. His hand was on the rifle that hung in a scabbard across his leg. "He is not for taking." "We're not asking to take him," another one said. "We're telling you, boys like that are worth money. We know where to bring him, where he'll bring $40 or $50. You don't seem the type to pass up $40 or $50. Silas had once believed in the logic of violence. He understood how to use it, and he had used it many times. He understood how to read the moment when a situation moved from words to action. He understood his own speed and his own capability, and he understood that the rifle on his leg would speak before their rifles spoke, if it came to that. But he also understood that there was another way. "These horses are worth $200 each," Silas said. His hand still rested on the rifle, but his voice was easy, conversational. "The gray mare trailing behind us is worth more. I have a cabin south of here with supplies enough to sustain a man for 6 months. I have connections with tribes up into Montana, and I have connections with army posts all the way to Santa Fe. The cavalry officers I rode with are still in the service. You know what I am saying to you." He had not said any of this with threat in his voice. He had said it the way a man might explain a problem in arithmetic. But the men understood. They understood that Silas Beckett was not a drifter or a settler they could frighten off. He was a man with resources and connections and knowledge, and the kind of knowledge that said he understood how to make their lives complicated if they took him on. One of them spit into the dust, but they turned their horses and they rode back the way they had come. Silas did not let his breath out for a long time after they disappeared over a ridge. Takotah's arms had been gripping his ribs so tightly that he had needed to remind the boy to breathe. But they were gone. That night, camping in a high meadow that looked out over country that rolled down toward the valleys below, Silas sat alone while Takotah slept. The boy was healing. The fever had not returned. The wound was beginning to show the white edges of scar tissue. Given time, the body would repair itself. But Silas was beginning to understand something about the choice he had made. He had taken a boy from his property and begun a journey through country that was not always kind to travelers. He had done this knowing that there were men who would want to take the boy from him, men who would see opportunity where Silas saw only another human being who needed help. He had done this knowing that there was a cavalry patrol somewhere in the territory, and there was no guarantee that the patrol would understand what he was doing or why. To them, a white man riding with an Apache child might look like kidnapping or treason. He had done this knowing that Takotah's father was somewhere in the mountains, and while Takotah seemed to believe that his father would understand and be grateful, Silas had no way of knowing this for certain. He had made a choice that might well destroy everything he had built in the last 5 years. He sat by the fire and understood with perfect clarity that he had already known all of this when he decided to do it. He had known it the moment he saw the boy sitting by the spring, and he had done it anyway. This suggested something to him about the man he actually was. as opposed to the man he had wanted to be. It suggested that the choice he had made when he was 32 years old, the choice to leave the cavalry, had not been enough. Some part of him was still trying to become someone different. Some part of him was still trying to prove that he could make the right choice, even when it cost him something. Some part of him had not actually left the cavalry at all. He had only left the uniform. On the 6th day of their journey, they encountered the cavalry. The patrol came up behind them on a section of trail that ran through high country where there was nowhere to hide. There were 8 soldiers, and they were led by a captain named Holbrook. Silas recognized him, though Holbrook was younger then, a lieutenant on the frontier, a man who had believed in the work with the kind of faith that comes from never having really understood what the work meant. "Stand," Holbrook called. His hand was on his rifle, and his men spread out in a line that made it clear they were ready to do violence if that was what the moment required. Silas stopped Roan and waited. Takotah had gone stiff against his back, and his hand had moved to the knife that hung at his side. Silas reached back and gently touched the boy's arm. "Easy," he said. "I know this man." Holbrook rode forward until he was close enough to see Silas's face clearly. Some change came over him then, some recognition that moved through his body like a shock. "Beckett," he said. "Silas Beckett. What in the hell are you doing with an Apache boy?" "Taking him home," Silas said. Holbrook looked at the boy and back at Silas. "That is not how this works. That boy is separated from his people," Silas said. "Wounded, lost. I am taking him to his people." "You are interfering with cavalry operations," Holbrook said, but his voice had changed. The certainty had drained out of it. "I know what you are searching for," Silas said. "I searched for the same things once. I was very good at it. I did not feel good about being good at it." He had not moved. Roan stood still beneath him, calm and patient the way good horses are. Takotah had stopped his hand on the knife. "The boy's father is Nochi," Silas said. "He is coming north with his people. You can bring violence to them if that is what you choose. But this boy is not your enemy, and I am not your enemy, and I will not give the boy to you." Holbrook sat on his horse and looked at Silas for a long time. The sun was beginning to move toward the horizon. The light was turning golden and strange. Behind Holbrook, his men waited for orders. "I cannot let you pass," Holbrook said finally. "Then you will have to stop me," Silas said. His voice was quiet. "And you know that you can do that. You know that you are 8 men, and I am 1. But you also know that I will not go quietly, and you will have to explain why a cavalry patrol spent its time and ammunition on a former officer who was simply returning a child to his family. You know that that story will follow you. You know that when you are old, that will be the thing people remember. It was not strategy. It was not a bluff. It was only the truth, spoken quietly in the fading light of late afternoon in high country. It was the truth about what happens to men who are given power and choose to use it against people who cannot defend themselves. Holbrook raised his hand, and his patrol turned their horses. They did not leave in a rush. They departed as if they had simply decided it was time to go somewhere else, as if the encounter had never happened. But they left. The terrain changed as they climbed higher. The grass became sparse, and then the land opened up into rockier country, country where the bones of the earth showed through thin skin of soil and lichen. Silas had never been this far into the mountains, but Takotah seemed to recognize landmarks now. The boy would point at a particular ridge or a particular formation of stone, and there would be a sound of recognition in his voice. The land began to feel inhabited. The air itself seemed to carry intention. On the 8th day, they crested a pass and saw, far below them, a valley that seemed to contain smoke. Not thick smoke, but smoke that rose from several places. Fires burning low, the kind of smoke that means people are living a careful life in a place they mean to stay for a while. The valley was enormous, opening out like a hand cupped to catch the light, and the mountains rose up on all sides like a fortress, like a promise. "There," Takotah said. His voice had changed completely. The exhaustion that had been living in his words had disappeared entirely. "That is where my people are. That is home." They descended slowly. The trail was rough and narrow, and Roan picked his way carefully. The land was becoming greener as they dropped in elevation, and they began to see evidence of animals. Apache ponies grazing in high pastures, tracks in the dusty trail where many horses had passed. When they were close enough to see the camp itself, Silas slowed Roan to a walk. The Apache were not surprised. They had seen Silas and Takotah coming from a long distance away. Lookouts had reported their approach hours before. By the time they reached the edge of the camp, riders were already moving toward them, not with weapons drawn, but alert, ready, moving with the kind of coordination that came from people who had been living the life of war and survival for a very long time. Takotah slid from Roan's back before they had come to a complete stop. He fell to his knees. Whether from exhaustion or emotion, it was impossible to tell. The riders reached him, and there was a moment of stillness, and then a man dismounted and held the boy. Silas understood, without anyone telling him, that this was Nochi, the boy's father. He held Takotah the way a man holds something that he thought was lost forever, and has somehow been returned to him against all likelihood. Silas got down from Roan. His legs were unsteady beneath him. He had ridden for 8 days with barely any sleep, and the adrenaline that had sustained him was beginning to drain away like water into sand. He stood beside his horse and waited to see what would happen next. A chief did not speak first in such a moment. There was protocol to these things, though Silas did not know what the protocol was. Nochi held Takotah a moment longer, and then he released him and stood. He looked at Silas. The chief was a man in his middle years, with silver braiding in his hair and the bearing of someone who had led people through impossible circumstances and had learned, through that leadership, something essential about what it means to be human. He said something in Apache to the men around him, and several of them turned and began moving deeper into the camp. Then Nochi walked toward Silas. The riders parted to let him through. Silas stood his ground, though every instinct in his body was telling him to run, to ride away, to leave this valley, and never look back. Nochi stopped a few paces from Silas and looked at him for a long time. He did not speak. He only looked, studying Silas's face the way a man studies something complicated that he is trying to understand. Then he raised his hand, not in violence, but in acknowledgement, and he spoke in English, broken but clear. "You brought my son home," he said. "I did," Silas said. "There are cavalry in this territory. There are men who hunt for money. You did this thing knowing the cost." "Yes," Silas said. Nochi turned away. He looked back toward the center of the camp, and then he turned back to Silas. "You will come to my lodge. You will eat with my family, and then we will show you what we do for men who see our son as people see sons." Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. Over the next hours, Silas experienced the kind of hospitality that only people living on survival's edge understand. Food was brought: roasted meat with roots, cornbread, cold water. The tribe came to look at Silas, to measure him. Takotah sat close to his father, his hand never leaving his arm. The wound was healing. The boy's face was lighter now. As the sun descended toward the horizon, riders began to appear at the far end of the valley. Dozens, then hundreds. They came down from the high country in a river of horses and men and dust, filling the valley like a tide. But all of that was smaller than the moment of the horses. The chief had risen and gestured toward the riders. Behind them was a herd of horses, hundreds of them, mares and stallions and young stock, moving with the coordination that came from a people who understood horses like musicians understand music. "This is what we give you," Nochi said. "These horses are yours. The herd is yours. You have saved the life of my son. Among my people, there is no gift greater than this. These horses, they are from the best lines. They are strong. They will breed true. And I give you also this: you can move through all our lands, and no one will harm you. You can hunt where we hunt. You can use the water sources. You are a friend of the people." Silas did not know what to say. The herd was worth a fortune. It was worth enough to change his life entirely. But it was the other thing that moved him more. The idea that he could move through this land without fear, that the covenant between him and the tribe had been formalized in a way that the territory would eventually understand. He knelt. It was not a gesture of submission. It was a gesture of respect, and of the understanding that something large had happened, something that would change him in ways he could not yet comprehend. He rode back south with the herd, moving slowly, which allowed time to think. The cost was much smaller than he had feared, and the gain much larger than he had hoped. When he returned, his cabin had been protected. No one had taken supplies. No outlaws had burned the structure. It was as if the land itself understood this property was under protection now. Silas lived another 42 years. The herd from Nochi grew and prospered, becoming the foundation of the largest horse operation in Colorado Territory. He never became wealthy in the urban sense, but he had horses, respect, and peace. Every summer, when smoke rose from the ridge, Silas would tend the cooking fire and wait for visitors. Takotah, growing into manhood, would come on his own horse. Later, with his family. The chief would come once a year to sit by the fire and speak of the years that had passed. Through these years, there was an understanding between them. Not friendship exactly, but the understanding of two men who made the same impossible choice. Silas died in 1920 in his cabin on a morning that smelled like sage and dust. The Apache people came to his funeral. The children and grandchildren of Nochi came and stood in that clearing south of the foothills, acknowledging the man who had ridden with a wounded boy toward the mountains. In the years after his death, the story traveled through the territory. It became one of those stories passed from generation to generation, changing slightly with each telling, but keeping its shape. The shape of a man who made the right choice even when it cost him something. Perhaps that is all the frontier ever teaches us. The difference between an enemy and a neighbor is usually just the choice of which one to decide to be. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor, and tell us in the comments. Would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one. Moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.